So why the future of sustainable protein? To answer this question, I'm going to kind of lay out all my cards. I'm a professor of global environmental politics. I'm an environmentalist deeply concerned about climate change. I'm an omnivore, a so-called foodie who relishes the perfectly cooked meal, as I'm sure many in this crowd are as well. And I'm the husband of a small-scale organic farmer who mainly raises livestock for a living. And over the last number of years, as I've navigated these roles, I've found myself specifically immersed in a number of discussions and debates, respectful debates, of course, about the role that livestock in particular ought or ought not to play in a more sustainable world. And I've followed and researched the emergence of new factors in this debate. And on the whole, I've found there to be a number of trends, but two worthy of mentioning today. The first is that the global agri-food sector is evolving very, very quickly. Change is being driven by a wide range of interconnected forces. So, for instance, we know that the global population is growing very quickly. Incomes in a number of developing nations are rising, and along with that, the demand for meat in particular is growing. Food security and nutrition is facing a sort of double burden of widespread hunger and growing obesity. Natural resources are being depleted and contaminated to a severe and alarming degree. New ethical perspectives and cultural attitudes about food and human relationships with animals and technologies are emerging. New innovations and technologies themselves are being developed. And of course, the world's climate is changing at an alarming pace. And these are just some of the factors that are driving rapid change in the global agri-food sector. And when it comes down to it, all of these forces raise questions about how humanity is essentially going to provide itself with that one essential micronutrient that we all need, protein. A second thing worth mentioning is that it's evident that we could use a little bit more nuance, context, and an embrace of complexity when it comes to making decisions, and especially policy decisions, about the future of sustainable protein. In short, it's a very complicated world out there. There are a lot of factors, a lot of actors with varying interests. There are different places with different access points to food. And on the whole, I have found that the proposed solutions to the deep challenges that we face are perhaps somewhat narrow and deserving of nuance. So that's why we're focusing on the future of sustainable protein here, and that's why we've gathered experts from so many different vantage points and perspectives to come and present on their approach to this challenge. Okay, so this is how the event's going to work. We're going to have 6 roundtables, 4 today and 2 tomorrow. And each roundtable showcases the work of 4 invited expert speakers, and each roundtable will be chaired by a fellow colleague, University of Ottawa professor. I have asked all of the speakers to keep their prepared comments very brief. In academic terms, 10 minutes is brief. So we're really going to hold, I'm asking the chairs also to hold the panelists to that timeline. And part of the reason for that is to maximize the amount of exchange and dialogue and informal discussion that occurs thereafter. So after all 4 speakers have presented, the chair is going to open it up to open dialogue between panelists and with the audience at large at their discretion. Finally, before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items that I wanted to address. The first is an important announcement that you should, and somewhat legalese here, but please be advised that this workshop is being filmed in its entirety, both for the purposes of live broadcast and recorded broadcasts in the future. The recordings will also be used to produce a short film about the workshop, which will be publicly available on the internet. So please note that by remaining in this room, you are implicitly consenting to the use of digital images of you and or your property for any of the outreach materials that are associated with this, this workshop. So you're not obligated to stay. If you would prefer to watch the conference proceedings from elsewhere, it is broadcast on a Facebook Live event. You can find it on our Facebook page. But if you have any questions about that process, please don't hesitate to come and ask myself. Okay, that's the legal part. Secondly, I wanted to draw your attention to our sponsors, our volunteer helpers, and our lead conference organizers, who are perhaps too numerous to name here, but all of them are listed in the program. In particular, I want to thank the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue series, which hosted and largely funded the bulk of this event. There are a couple other events held under the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue, which are similar types of events seeking to create dialogue around important and in some cases controversial issues on campus. So I encourage you to check out the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue website to see some of the other events that are taking place under that banner. But again, I want to thank all the sponsors and organizers for helping to make this event possible. In particular, I want to put a face to the name Shannon Sinclair. Maybe you can stand up and wave. Thank you, Shannon. She really does deserve a special thanks for her organizational efforts. And if there are any questions about the administration of the event, you can either bring them to her or myself. So thanks again. I think that's it for announcements for now, and we may have a couple more things to say before the break, but we should probably get to the panel now, and I hope that the IT people will arrive very shortly. So with that, I think what I'll do is I'll call up the four panelists and the chair to come up and get themselves set up, and welcome, in particular, Dr. Geoff McCartney, who's an assistant professor here at the University of Ottawa in the School of International Development and Global Studies. And he's also the research director at the Institute of Environment and the Smart Prosperity Institute, who will be introducing the first roundtable.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. So as Ryan mentioned, my name is Geoff McCartney. I'm a professor here in the Faculty of Social Sciences. I also spend half my time in the university's Interdisciplinary Institute of the Environment, where we work with students across a range of topics, including environmental economics, environmental law, political science, and environmental sciences. So it's not unlike the challenge we have before us here today of trying to merge a range of conversations around challenging topics. We've picked a fairly modest beginning to try to address the challenges of meeting the protein demands of the world's growing population. So an interesting topic, and I'm sure it will spur a range of good discussion across the panelists we have here today. I was sitting just brainstorming for 2 minutes before we got here, trying to think about the range of possible issues that could come up, and things that cross my mind, not being an expert in this particular topic, are things like land use, climate change, development, growth, politics, equality, health, culture, and identity, and I'm sure I'm missing a range of very relevant topics. But our aim here is to try to tackle these things and to begin a dialogue across these themes to help guide further research initiatives. So my understanding is we're both trying to dive into what we know and also really trying to drive at what are key gaps in our understanding and our knowledge, where could we do additional work going forward in this research program with Ryan. I've been told we're fairly strict on time for the panelists, so we have 10 minutes for initial comments. I don't think I have cards, so what I'll do is I'll put this blue... when you hit 10 minutes, if you're up at the podium, I'll put the blue folder ahead where you can see it. That suggests please wrap up your current thought. Once you get much past 12 minutes, I'll interject at an appropriate point to keep things moving along, okay? So fair warning in that regard. The idea is then we'll move to a moderated discussion. I'd like to give the panelists a chance to go back and forth with each other first, then to the roundtables and audience questions as well. Okay, so to introduce our panelists quickly before we get going, This is the order I had them on in the agenda I saw, so I hope it approximately reflects where we're supposed to go. First is Goretty Diaz, who's an assistant professor at the School of Environment and Enterprise and Development at the University of Waterloo. Second is Hugo Melgar-Quiñonez, director of the McGill University Institute for Global Food Security. Third, I have Brent Preston, who is an organic farmer, also a speaker and author of The New Farm. And fourth is Mike von Massow, who is a professor. This is a slight change from the agenda. He's actually a professor in the Department of Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics at the University of Guelph. So I think we have about 90 minutes until about 10:15 for this panel. Do we have slides ready to go? So we should be all set. Turn it over to Professor Diaz.
So yes, I'm Goretty Diaz. In my research, I use life cycle approaches and perspectives, looking at impacts across the food system from farm to fork. I'm also interested in looking at the impacts of dietary patterns. And today I want to make 3 main points based on my research and related experiences. First one is that livestock protein is not sustainable in its production or at today's consumption levels, being very specific about that. Second, there are opportunities and challenges associated with alternative proteins. And third, there are other sustainability aspects that are in tension with reducing livestock protein. But before I even begin with those points, I just wanted to show you this map, which, based on 2013 data, shows the protein supply. And basically it says that most countries have at least twice the protein that the average person needs. So right away, we see that the future protein asks us to understand how much we actually will need in the future, since we've already got twice what we need, and how it will be distributed, which is a question in food security. Back to my points. I'm very certain that the way livestock is being produced and the rates at which meat is being consumed is not environmentally sustainable. And if we look at the current land use, illustrated on this map based on proportions, not distribution, we see that about 30% of available land on the left here with the red is used for livestock and for growing the crops that feed them. And we have right now in the world, just to give you an idea how much livestock we have, just 1 billion head of cattle alone. In contrast, only 10% of that land, which we see in the fuchsia color there, is used for growing crops for human consumption directly. So there aren't a lot of places that we can put more livestock or grow the feed for it without starting to encroach into forests and other ecosystems. We're also exceeding the boundaries of what's considered safe for the planet when it comes to biodiversity loss and the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, which is shown in red here. And we're also, there's an increasing risk that land system change and climate change is going beyond the zone of uncertainty as to whether the planet can handle what we're doing in terms of climate change and land use. So these are all greatly affected by agricultural production, so it's a really important thing to consider. We did a study that's just been published in PLOS One, where we analyzed land and climate change impacts associated with a healthy diet using the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate, which is based on the best available nutrition science. It's not a food guide based on national guidelines. On the left, we show the carbon footprint of 2011 productions for 7 billion people, which in the red part of the bar is due to animal protein. And in the middle, we have what the carbon footprint would be of a healthy diet for 7 billion people. And on the right, if we start trying to feed 9 billion people on a healthy diet, we're sort of back to where we started. So it's very hard to reduce our carbon footprint without trying to reduce milk and beef and meat consumption. I also, my research is strongly related to Sustainable Development Goal 12, which is responsible consumption and production. And I looked at, my student and I looked at an example or a sample of Ontario diets based on the Canadian Community Health Survey. And we formulated dietary patterns based on what people currently eat. And based on that, we did a carbon footprint And we found that for the most common diets, which was like a no beef and omnivore diet, so different types of omnivore diets, that the main part of the carbon impact was beef consumption, shown here in purple. You can see at the bottom here, from chicken to beef, you see a large difference in carbon footprint for different types of meat. So, as this shows, along with this double food and environmental pyramid that was developed by the Barilla Nutrition Center, when we eat for our health and well-being, we also have a lower impact. And that sustainable production and consumption of food is key to addressing sustainable development goals. So in terms of sustainable protein, what other options do we have? First, I want to say that no matter what type of food we're talking about, we need to move more to regenerative agriculture modules, which I'm sure people will be talking about during this workshop. Technologically speaking, we have things like cultured meat or lab meat and meat analogs. And from a life cycle perspective, looking at the environmental footprint of these, they do have much less impact than regular meat. But I wonder if we're missing anything in terms of sustainability and health, and what types of impacts might occur as we scale up from demonstration projects to feeding more populations. And meat analogs, which is basically taking plant proteins and processing them to recreate the texture and taste of meat, are gaining popularity. And they also have low life cycle impacts compared to meat. But they do require a lot of processing of ingredients. And again, I think, are there any health concerns? And what happens when we scale up production? Because we see lots of life cycle studies showing this is great until you start scaling up, and then we get into all kinds of problems. We have the potential of new crops for reducing impact and creating healthy protein. And one of them, I just picked them out of the whole bunch of them, but lupin is one thing that they're looking at. But as any new crop, we need to consider it in terms of sustainability, from its use of fertilizers, chemicals, water use, land use, and whether it's an invasive species like lupin can be. We also need a lot more work on improving aquaculture and making it more sustainable. We've already overfished most of the commercial fish species, but fish, and particularly fatty fish, can be very good for our health. So aquaponics provides us both fish protein and vegetables, which we will also need more of in the future. So we're going to be short on vegetables for a growing population. And vegetables are very vulnerable to the climate and drought and frost. And they also travel long distances, and there's a lot of waste associated with that. And finally, if we look at new products, mycoprotein or insect protein, one of the biggest challenges, and I'll speak specifically for insect protein, as well as for aquaculture, is getting a sustainable feed source. They still have to be fed. And so to maximize economic benefits, often grains are used to feed fish and insects. But life cycle studies show that between the grains or the feed that you give insects and the energy use associated with them, there's certainly certain insects that are better than others, and sometimes there's no difference between insects and, let's say, chicken. It just depends on the conditions and type of insects you're growing. So finally, some of the tensions, and I like to couch this in terms of also some of the sustainable development goals. One of the first things I think about is cultural heritage through culinary practices, where we might lose some of this due to a reduced, if we go to less meat. But it remains to be seen whether cultured meat or meat analogs can protect our cultural heritage. For small producers who rely on livestock for nutritional security and income, and in regions where people can't grow other food because of the climate, as in northern regions, animal agriculture makes a lot of sense. It's likely that we can achieve environmental sustainability and still meet some of our health aspects of meat consumption, but who gets to choose who can keep livestock if we have to go down that path? And finally, we understand more, as we understand more about animal intelligence, and I know some people are going to be touching on this today, even if we reduce livestock production to those areas where it is sustainable and where ecosystems don't allow other types of food production, we may begin to question our right to keep animals for food. So these are really my perspectives. These are the issues that keep me up at night. I don't get to see visions of sugar plums. And so I'm looking forward to the rest of the workshop to see what we can learn from each other about the future of protein. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next we have Professor Melgar-Quiñonez.
I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very thankful for the invitation. Congratulations to the organizers and to the University of Ottawa for this event. I have a number of thoughts, some reflections, perhaps some facts that I would like to share with you. And each of these lines could be expanded for a long time, which we don't have, but I'm hopeful that we will have the opportunity to discuss this further. I come from the Institute of Global Food Security at McGill University, and at the center of our work, we put what we call the definition of food security. It's a consensual definition that was put in place 22 years ago at an international conference at the World Food Summit of that year in 1996. And it talks about not only food security existing when there is sufficient food for everybody at all times, but it talks also about the quality, the nutritional quality, and the safety of such foods. Food that should help people not only to meet the dietary needs, but also to meet their cultural preferences, their traditions, what we call their food memories. The burns that we're confronting, and at some point the double burn was mentioned here, the double burn of stunting and obesity, coexisting within a household, within a community, and so on. I do think that there are many other burns. Some colleagues, especially in the areas of food safety, talk about the triple burn, adding issues related to the safety of the production of other kinds of foods, novel kinds of foods, unexploited kinds of foods that might help us tackle the question of this panel. Are we able to feed the increasing world population with protein, yes or no? And I'm not sure if we have an answer. What I can tell you is that food insecurity is a global problem. And some reports, especially the traditional reports by the United Nations, the state of food insecurity in the world, have been informing us that around 820 million individuals go to bed hungry. 820 million individuals have no access or cannot consume basic energy requirements. Only calories, that's the number. And the number is calculated, the estimate is based on a sedentary life. Meaning, if we were able to measure the physical activity of people and therefore have a better estimate of the energy requirements, and the number of people who go to bed hungry every day would be much larger. It's an increasing problem. The two last reports by the United Nations, as I said, traditionally presented by FAO, are now presented by a consortium of United Nations agencies, organizations, including the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and others. Some of the numbers show as well that 1 in 4 individuals on this planet deal with iron deficiency anemia. 1 in 3 women. In sub-Saharan Africa, in some areas of Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, Southern Asia, stunting, meaning a deficiency in the growth of children, affects more than 1 in 3 children. That's the state of food insecurity we're dealing with. In our collaboration and in the work we do, particularly across Latin America and Africa, we have been able to develop other kinds of measures that gives us other kind of situation and a different magnitude of the problem. Through personal, professional conversations, we do think that 820 hungry people are really an underestimation. And we're thinking about 2 to 3 billion people dealing with food insecurity at different levels. There are dimensions that we integrate in the reflections around food security. The dimension of food production, food availability, that's the first one. The dimension of access, which is impaired mainly by people not having the means to access and afford and purchase the foods they need. The dimension of utilization, which is closely related certainly to the use of foods, to the nutritional value, to the safety of the foods. But we usually forget about, from my perspective, the most important, or perhaps most critical dimension of food security, which is related to stability, social, environmental, economic, and political stability. And the last two reports by United Nations showing an increase in the, not only the number, but also in the prevalence of food insecurity around the world, reflects upon the impact of conflict and climate change in those increases. Inequality is another big issue that refers to this dimension of stability, social stability. I don't know if you have heard about the syndrome that plagues some areas of sub-Saharan Africa called Conso. Conso is related to the consumption of cassava. And cassava is rich in cyanides. And mainly women and children suffer this illness that affects critically the nerve system, the central nerve system, but not the men. And many of us have thought the women are the ones who are processing the cassava. The women and children are close by. They are processing, they are working on the cassava, they are exposed to the cyanides, but not the men. And that's probably the problem. Well, let me tell you that if those women were able to consume some animal protein, which is what protects the men, they wouldn't have to deal with this syndrome in the way they do. The consumption of protein, animal protein in this case, is key to prevent the issue. Another reflection goes towards where does the protein come from that we consume? A protein supply comes mainly around 60%, 57% from plant sources, 18% from meat, 10% from dairy, 6% from fish, and 9% from other sources that were mentioned in the first presentation. Insects, algae, new technologies to produce meat, etc., which carry with them also other challenges, not only technological challenges. 2,000 species of insects are consumed around the world, especially in developing countries. Mexican people consume 500 different species of insects. There are, therefore, some, I wouldn't say solutions, but approaches that should be explored more in depth. But I do think that it's critical that this happens within a context of cultural, respectful approaches, of the rescue of those food memories. There are things that are being consumed by the poorest of the poor and could be good sources to tackle this problem. So one of the things that I reflect upon in terms of approaches refers to the diversification of the sources of protein that we consume. I had a word here around policy. I do think that it will be discussed later. From my perspective, I do think that rescuing, innovating, rescuing new practices, exploring novel approaches, promotion of things that are basically close to the problem is important. I do think I'm optimistic by nature. That's my main burden, I guess, but sometimes it helps to be critical as well. I think that if you're critical, you might be an optimist. But I do think that it is possible to tackle the issue, and some numbers show that as well. I come originally from Guatemala, this country where I grew up, a country plagued by food insecurity, where 50% of the children are stunted. I was a basketball player in Guatemala. Sorry for the joke. There is, and to wrap up before I finish, I think we need a much broader approach. We need to think out of the box. And I'm going to share you an anecdote from the time when your ancestors, most of your ancestors, and my ancestors arrived to this continent over 500 years ago. And a Spaniard conquistador was talking to a Guarani chief in Paraguay, and was explaining to the Guarani chief the vision that the Europeans brought to this continent. And the chief was listening carefully and replied, "You know what? I like what you're telling me. I like that vision. It's a good vision, actually. I really think it scratches very well. The problem is it scratches when there is no itching. We have to scratch where it itches." Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next up, we have Brent Preston.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Is it on the same? All right, thank you very much. It's really great to be here. I want to thank Ryan for inviting me. I have to say that this is a new thing for me. I'm used to talking to audiences that know less about food systems than I do, so it's a bit of a role reversal. So I wanted to start out, try to establish some credibility. Just by show of hands here, we're talking about the future of protein. How many people in this room have killed an animal in order to eat it themselves? Oh, that totally backfired. Everybody is at it. Yeah. I had a whole spiel set up if like one or two people raised their hands, but that's gone. So as we get the slides going here, is that going to work? I hope so. Anyway. That's okay. I'm a farmer. My wife and I grow organic vegetables on a small farm northwest of Toronto near the village of Creemore. But we don't sell animals, but we don't sell meat, but we raise animals for our own consumption that we kill and butcher on the farm. And I come from a long line of butchers, so this idea of the future of protein is very interesting to me. I'm going to talk today just briefly about my observations from the production side. I'm not a researcher, but I've spent a long time interacting with and talking to and observing the conventional farmers in our neighborhood where I farm, and all of them are farming in the same way. They're growing commodity crops in large monocultures using big machinery and lots of chemicals. And when I try to talk to the people in my neighborhood about the possibility of a different model that we're trying to pursue, small scale for the local market, growing organically, the thing that they always say to me is, what you're doing won't feed the world. So the way that the sort of conventional agriculture community justifies and talks about the processes they use is by appealing to this idea of feeding the world. And when you're growing on a small scale organically, you're not solving the problem. And this idea or attitude has been deeply internalized by the conventional farmers that I talk to, that the goal of conventional agriculture is to feed the world, and that conventional agriculture is necessary to feed the world. There are big consortiums of chemical input producers and agriculture input producers who have aggressive social media campaigns to try to convince Canadians of this idea as well, that without pesticides we couldn't grow the amount of food that we need. We wouldn't have food security if it wasn't for all of these agricultural inputs. And I think largely they've been successful in convincing the Canadian public of this. but when I look around at our neighborhood, at what the farmers are producing around me, I often talk about the field right across the street from our farm, which is a single field that's bigger than our whole operation. We only grow about 20 acres of vegetables. And that's a small field in the scheme of things in our area. And that field that I see every day across the road from us is growing, oh, here we are. So that's our farm. We're going to zip through this because I've gone ahead. This is what I'm talking about, the social media campaign to try to convince Canadians that we need these kind of inputs and we need this kind of conventional farming system in order to feed the world. I know that that's a lie because I grow a lot of lettuce, but the people in our neighborhood have really bought into it completely, and like I said, most Canadians, I think, have bought into it as well. So our operation, you can see there, is a total of less than 20 acres, and the farm right across the road, the field right across the road grows a steady rotation of corn, soy, and canola year after year. And I've been watching that field for 15 years, and it's the same rotation year after year. And it occurred to me at one point, first of all, that there was an incredible amount of stuff coming off that land. Just that one 20-acre field was producing tractor trailer loads of commodities every year. But it also occurred to me that that none of what it was producing you could actually eat. And this is a little mental exercise that I often talk about when I'm speaking to audiences. The next time you're out on a drive through farm country, if you stopped your car and walked into any particular field, would there be anything there that you could actually eat? And the answer is almost always no, anywhere in North America and large swaths of the world. Everything that's being grown across the street from my farm and on almost every farm in North America either has to be fed to animals or processed in order to be eaten. So it didn't take a whole lot of research from my sort of lay background to realize that in terms of calories, we've got a huge overabundance of food in the world. Somewhere in the neighborhood, I think, of at least 25% excess of calories available at the household level. Even in Africa, despite all the food insecurity that Hugo was talking about, on average, we've got more food available at the household level than is required for normal human activity. So I think that all of the problems, or many of the problems we see with our current food system are best understood when you think about a food system that's producing too much food. And I won't talk about this in detail because I know this is the subject of the other roundtables, but the most obvious impact here is human health, where the Lancet estimates that 3 times as many people now die of obesity-related illness compared to malnutrition. We see it in our own communities at every income level, this epidemic of diet-related illness and disease. There are the obvious environmental impacts. Animal agriculture is the biggest driver of habitat loss. Climate, of course, we're going to be talking a lot about this, the enormous impact of animal agriculture in particular on the climate. But there's also problems with the farm economy. So we see that in our area, the farm across the road from us is farmed by a farmer who lives several kilometers away and farms all sorts of different farms that he leases out from the owners because you need huge scale in order to make a living when you have an overabundance of food and therefore food is extremely cheap. So in the last 5 years, Statistics Canada says we've lost 23,000 farmers and in Canada, and the average farm income is now negative, and 41% of Canadian farmers work off-farm in order to make a living. My wife and I work full-time on the farm and have no other source of income, and we are the only farm family that I know of anywhere in our community that is in that situation. But the most important impact of this overproducing food system, I think, is on the effect it's having on the productive capacity of our land. So the sort of universally accepted model that's prevalent in our neighborhood of large machinery, large monocrops, commodity production, and extensive use of agricultural chemicals is, in almost every situation, a degenerative model of growing food. It's reducing the productive capacity of our land. It destroys soil organic matter. It leads to topsoil loss, erosion, and eventually dramatic decreases in productive capacity and desertification. So this is to me the biggest problem with the food system or with the productive system we have right now, is that it's reducing our, it's eventually going to reduce our capacity to grow food. So when you look at the question that conventional agriculture says that they're asking, how are we going to feed the world? The question that they're really asking is, how are we going to feed the market? And that's a very, very different question. So when there's a huge market in North America for corn to create ethanol, and there are many farmers in our community who are growing corn for ethanol production. That's obviously doing nothing to feed the world. When we look at the question of increasing incomes and changing lifestyles in emerging markets like China and India, when we're saying, how are we going to keep up with the protein demand in that area? Well, if the protein consumption is leading to poor health and environmental problems, to me that's not feeding the world, that's feeding the market. And the important thing, I think, to recognize is that from a producer standpoint, every level of government in Canada, all of the major, or most of the major farm organizations, most farmers, and virtually all of our publicly funded agriculture schools are completely focused on expanding this model of agriculture to the exclusion of almost everything else. So as a progressive organic farmer, we get basically zero support or input from any level of government or any publicly funded institution. So another way to ask this question of how are we going to feed the market really is, how are we going to facilitate continued overconsumption? And so that's a very dangerous when we're conflating those two ideas of feeding the world and facilitating overconsumption. And unfortunately, all of the levels of government and public institutions are answering that question by saying we're going to use agricultural practices that are going to make it more difficult to feed ourselves in the future. So the question, I think, is not how much food do we need to produce, because that's always the question. It's how are we going to produce that food? And what food are we going to produce? And to me, the what is obvious from what other people are saying already and what we're going to talk about here. It's less meat, it's looking at alternatives, it's more fruits and vegetables and whole foods, foods that people can actually eat that we want to be growing. And the question of how, to me, is regenerative agriculture. And I don't want to, I know Gabrielle's going to be speaking about this, and I really wanted to do a whole presentation on regenerative agriculture, but I didn't want to steal topic matter from future roundtables. But in the progressive farming community, in terms of organic and conventional farmers, everybody right now is talking about regenerative. This is what everybody is excited about, and it's a suite of low-tech, cheap, effective methods that move carbon from the atmosphere to the soil. And I think that's really where, and it has a huge role to play for animal agriculture as well. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And our last speaker is Professor von Massow.
I have no slides. No. I have no slides. So one of the benefits of having no slides is when you're last, you realize you're going to skip chunks of what you were going to talk about because of what the previous speakers have covered. So I'm going to apologize if I repeat some things, but I think they're important. And I'm going to raise some of the issues that other speakers have raised, probably through my own lens, and maybe give you a little bit different spin. Most of my work is at the consumer end of the food chain, is thinking about how people think about food and how we make food decisions. And where I'm going to finish is talking about if we are going to make some of the changes that we're talking about here at this panel, and I think in future, in some of the panels coming up, is we're going to have to drive change at the consumer level. We're going to have people make decisions differently, because it doesn't matter, frankly, if we have products that can more sustainably provide protein if people aren't willing to eat them. So the question that I started with was, can we meet the protein demands of the world sustainably? And we heard Ryan say in the introduction, demand is going up for food generally as population grows, and as incomes rise, we're seeing the demand for protein also go up. And so how do we meet those increasing protein demands sustainably? And I've split that question into 3 questions. The first is, can we produce the protein? And I think we heard to a degree from Goretty some of the things we can do differently. I'm only going to touch on those things very quickly. There are protein sources that are more sustainable. Plant-based proteins are varied and available. Pulses are a huge crop in Canada that are probably significantly underconsumed, particularly in the Western world, and I think provide a real opportunity to provide protein to our diets. We see soy-based proteins, tofu, tempeh, edamame, I think, that can also provide and augment our protein. Nuts, I think we heard one speaker talk about algae and seaweed. I think there are a variety of plant-based proteins that we're presenting in a number of different forms to consumers that can provide good, healthy proteins. Goretty also raised the issue of farmed fish. Probably today, 60% of the fish that we're seeing in retail, 60 or 70% of the fish that we're seeing in retail is probably farmed already. Ontario has a huge captive aquaculture system that is also providing good, nutritious protein. We heard also about insect proteins. How efficient they are to produce depends, as Goretty says, to a significant degree as to what feedstuff we're using. We're seeing sometimes we're feeding byproduct to them, but if we're diverting things from the food system, the argument is they're maybe not much better than chicken in terms of conversions. We can use waste in some cases. And we understand that those are going mainstream now because you can get President's Choice cricket powder in Loblaws. So these are not sort of abstractions. There are still significant ick factors, but what we need to articulate, I think, to a significant degree to consumers is this isn't a cricket where you feel the feet scratching the roof of your mouth. These aren't sort of novelty treats. These are real proteins that we can build into diets. And we heard about lab-grown meat products. And we're also seeing progress in production technology where we are more efficiently producing some of our conventional proteins. So, to a degree, there are options out there and that probably provide a more sustainable solution as we see protein demand goes up. To me, the second question is, and we heard some of the previous speakers talk about this as well, is how much do we really need? And I think there are a number of issues relative to that question, how much do we need? Food waste is a significant issue. We are throwing away, we are losing food throughout the system, and I think that is something that doesn't come into the discussion enough, although we're hearing more and more. We're probably not wasting a lot of protein throughout the we're not wasting a lot of meat protein throughout the value chain, but that doesn't. That's not the only place, and that waste also means we're tying up productive capacity for food that's not actually making it, where we could be using it for other uses, and for some of the plant-based proteins, waste throughout the production system becomes an issue. Now, there's always the issue of cost, and we understand perishability is a real constraint in food, but the reality is we are probably throwing away a lot more than we need to, and if we focus on that, that would mean we have a broader base of food available for consumption. We also heard about the issue of overconsumption in the developed world, protein specifically and food generally. We're probably eating more, well not probably, we are eating more than we need. We're taking in more calories, we're taking in more protein. Kate and I were having a discussion beforehand, we're feeding our pets more protein than we probably need to. So we are using more protein than we need to. So if we could get to a spot where we're taking in an appropriate amount of protein, that would also, A, free up more protein for others that need it, and reduce the overall demand for protein. We also heard Ryan talk about non-farm uses of farmland, non-food uses of farmland. Ethanol and other industrial products are using up huge amounts of our crop outputs. And we need to think, if we are food constrained, if that's a good use. Those are policy driven. It's not clear that they are doing much in terms of climate change or the contribution to emissions, but it does, to me, to a significant degree, and I'm glad I'm in this audience, because when I say this in other groups, I often get things thrown at me. This is a farm policy issue. The reason we are producing grain for ethanol is to raise grain prices. And perhaps, as Ryan said, we have issues with overproduction and low prices leading to the need for farm policy to raise prices. But what we're doing is we're taking land production out of food production and sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul to a significant degree. So given that, why are we required to have this discussion? Why do we have issues right now? And the thing is, what we need to do is convince people to eat differently. We need to convince people to eat less. We need to convince people to eat less protein. And we need to convince people to at least vary the amount of protein that they eat. And that, to me, is probably the critical step here, because without that, none of the other stuff matters. So, as Westerners, as people in developed countries, we can't expect others to change behavior if we're unwilling to, right? And we hear that all the time with respect to other environmental things. You know, well, we can't expect the developing world to lower their carbon footprint if we're not willing to either. We've developed ours on the back of carbon emissions, and we say, oh no, you guys got to stop. But that relates to food too. Now, I think there is some reason for optimism. Almost 85% of Canadians are saying they're eating at least one main meal per month without animal-based protein. 50% are saying they're doing that once a week. Those people are going to drive change in protein production, in protein consumption, much more than the 7 or 8% that are vegetarian or vegan. They're important, but they're also different. I think we're seeing a change, and it's those sort of flexitarians, as they make adjustments, that are going to have the most significant impact on protein demand going forward and on changing behavior. So those numbers aren't big yet, but they're probably significantly different than they were 5 years ago. And I think we need to continue to work on that. We need to motivate change. I read, I think on this conference Twitter feed, something that Ryan wrote about embracing complexity. And the truth is, we're not going to have one message that drives consumer behavior. Consumers are eating more variety. We have to understand what's important to them. We need to understand what's coming, and we need to offer food products to them that are relevant to their context. Some want meat analogs, plant-based burgers. They want that real experience with the heme and, you know, the red. Others don't want that experience at all, and we can offer them things. We also need to make sure we reflect convenience that is driving some people. Pulses I talked about. 70% of Canadians don't know what they're going to have for dinner at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Pulses require soaking and all of that. So we have to come up with ways to make that protein more accessible to someone who wants to grab something or throw something together when they get home. So understanding those challenges at the consumer level becomes critical to driving consumer change. So I think I'm out of time, and to wrap up, just understanding that consumers will be a big part of achieving and driving change, I think, is critical. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to all the speakers for being so diligent about staying on time. I didn't have to use my blue folder even once. That was great. So to give people a chance, we're going to move to a discussion now, and I'll let the speakers have a chance to respond to each other quickly and then some feedback from the audience. And just to give you a moment to think about your questions, I mean, Mike helped me with this a fair bit, summarizing some of the key points, but just a quick summary. We heard from Goretty that livestock is not sustainable at current production levels, and she spoke to issues such as consumption and highlighting distributional issues in terms of protein consumption around the world, as well as land use and production issues and where things are being produced. She also framed unknown challenges as we scale alternatives to current protein and what sort of tensions or trade-offs that might frame. We heard from Professor Melgar-Quiñonez about a range of food security issues, food security construed as access and base requirements, as well as nutritional quality and safety issues. How do we meet dietary needs, which includes factors such as culture, tradition, and food memories. This was framed as a global challenge, and he brought up questions about, do we have the right measures, and are we capturing the range of activities that people actually undertake in terms of basic requirements, as well as issues such as equality, gender was raised, and stability in food security is a key issue. And he raised the idea of diversifying sources of protein. From Preston, we heard about appealing to the idea of feeding the world and a dichotomy between small-scale versus conventional farming. He raised issues of calories versus quality of food, and whether we are producing animal feed and food that requires processing versus whole food that can be for human consumption. This was linked to issues of the farm economy as well, and production and income. And at the end, he raised the question of feeding the world versus feeding the market, and the 2 points of how are we producing and what are we producing with a discussion of regenerative agriculture. And finally, Professor von Massow spoke mainly to driving change at the consumer level. How do we convince people to eat differently, addressing different groups of food consumers as well, and understanding challenges at the consumer level. So quite a range of ideas, and what I thought we'd do is, Mike just spoke, but maybe have a chance for people to respond in reverse order, starting with Preston, and then Mike can jump in when they want, or if anybody has a particular pressing issue, you can feel free to jump in.
I guess I'll jump in. I just want, just Goretty, when you talk about the sort of very, very sort of broad statement that the production of protein right now is unsustainable. The volume and the method that we use is not sustainable. I think that's probably true, but I think there's a huge scope for changing the way we produce protein to make it much more sustainable. And the key, I think, is that our sort of conventional agricultural system has separated the production of, separated animals from where their feed comes from. So by integrating animals into fruit and vegetable production, integrating them into the production of their own feed in terms of having animals on pasture and having rotations that are not, corn, soy, canola over and over again, but are, fodder, pasture, vegetable production, we can have huge benefits for the soil and dramatically increase the amount of protein we produce on a given amount of land, especially with techniques like planned or managed grazing. So to me, I think that the goal has been, for the past 50 years, to figure out the cheapest possible way to produce food. And when it's just the market driving your production choices, very, very short-term considerations, you end up with the kind of system we have now, which is unsustainable. But by changing the way that we produce it, we can actually increase the amount we can produce and do it in a way that's, instead of degenerative, is actually environmentally beneficial.
Grady, did you want to reply?
Yeah, I agree with you, Brent.
Thanks.
And so part of the problem with the reason why meat, and we got to remember, we're talking about protein demand versus meat demand. So there's two different things here. But meat internationally is produced sometimes not efficiently, sometimes, like you said, with the animals separated from their food sources. And I think that, and I don't want to take away anybody else's talk here, but there's certain places and certain ways of, especially the most problematic one is cattle, there's certain ways of making them more efficient. So a lot of the problem that we have right now with producing meat and all the greenhouse gas emissions that come from cattle is that we don't give them good sources of feed. And I'm not talking about grain, I'm just talking about not having enough feed or the right type of feed or pastures that aren't healthy enough. So there's a lot of room for efficiencies, just better management of our livestock to reduce some of the impacts. But then there's this whole thing is like, how much land do we want to commit? Even with these efficiencies, improvements in efficiencies, how much land can we commit when we're taking away so much from ecosystems right now, which is undermining our ability to grow, to survive as a species as well. So I agree with you, there's a lot of places we could improve, and it's this model of factory farming and efficiencies in the Western system, and then inefficiencies in some of the developing world that's causing a lot of problems.
Mike or Hugo, did you want to feed in on anything? And I apologize, Brent, I had your last name written down. Sorry.
I would like to raise a point that I do think was part of our panel. But I challenge us, all of us, to move from global figures to more local figures. And what I'm trying to say is, as an example, international estimates of food insecurity, meaning people not having access to the nutrients we're talking about, are based on developing world countries. In 2014, a number of institutions, among others, some of our colleagues, our institutions at McGill, put out a report on food insecurity among Indigenous people in Canada. This report was presented by the Canadian Council of Academies. It showed that in some places in Canada, certainly in the north mainly, food insecurity affects up to 70% of the households in the territories. 70%. That's much higher than some developing countries in economy we have. And that's the problem we're dealing with. And certainly, there are different kinds of forces that drive that situation. Yes, income in impoverished populations in developing countries, we used to call them third world countries, you know. I don't know if the younger people are familiar with that term, but we used to call them that way. Coming from a third world country, I learned from the beginning of my life what does that exactly mean. Yes, income is increasing. And from a global perspective, we're thinking about providing people, providing the market with many different products that perhaps people just don't want to consume. Just don't have the money to afford. Yes, income is increasing. It is increasing. In many cases, it goes to the purchase of such devices like the screen we have there. There are market forces that are driving that behavior as well. People are consuming high amounts of refined sugars and refined flours. The consumption of pulses in India for the last 50 years, roughly, declined in 50%. The consumption of beans in Mexico, I'm talking about central staple foods to those countries, declining the same way, while the consumption of refined sugar increasing 200 and 300% respectively. These are things that we need to tackle, not only from, again, a global perspective mainly driven from what we discuss in forums like this, in our academic centers, in places where we're also facing challenges that are local, that are close to us, but we need to look closer to what's going on the ground, I would say.
Mike, do you want to pick up on that? And then just a note that I'll come to the tables after, so if you want to start thinking of questions, or signal to me if you have something to add in.
One of the things that I would add to Brent's comments is that I agree fundamentally with sort of thinking about how we produce. Sustainability is less about scale necessarily than about thinking about the production practices that we're using. And I think often we get this explicit trade-off between, oh, well, big farms are bad versus small farms. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. I think that in some cases it's about the production practices that we use that is important in terms of sustainability. Some of the largest farms on the prairies are organic farms, and it's about thinking differently in terms of stewardship of the land, soil organic matter, soil health, and all of those sorts of things. And I think we are changing the paradigm for production. One of the things that I'll often say when I speak to producer groups is that farmers need to start thinking of themselves as managers rather than as producers, because it will make them think differently how they manage the assets that they have. And you know, I talk to students and people who've been in production for a long time, and they say, I'm a producer, I produce this. And that makes them think very narrowly about what they produce. And I agree. I think we've lost, excuse me, I think we've lost that sort of integrated, diversified farm production that we've had that is really, to me, is a key to sustainability. Thinking about that acre of land as an asset, and how do I make sure that I sustain the productive capacity of that while making sure I get a reasonable output from that land. And so the one thing I'd say is we need to, there is nothing wrong with small-scale production, but there's also nothing wrong with large-scale production. It is about what we're doing in that production process that I think is critical.
Okay. Did you have anything?
Yeah, just quickly, I completely agree. The problem is that the information and advice on how farmers can change their practices and be more sustainable has been almost completely outsourced to private corporations who have an interest in selling farmers' inputs. So there is no public agricultural extension that I'm aware of left in Canada, at least in Ontario. So there was one guy who worked for the Ministry of Agriculture in Ontario, a guy named Hugh Martin, who was the organic specialist, and he retired 5 years ago and wasn't replaced. So as long as we have all of the information on how we can change our practices and how we can, you know, how we should produce our food, regardless of scale, coming from companies that have a vested interest in selling us stuff, I think we're going to have an uphill battle.
It's interesting. There are apparently a lot of Martins in organic.
Yeah.
Because I was talking to Ralph Martin at the university the other day, and one of the things that he highlighted to me is the value that organics research brings to non-organic agriculture. Sure. Is that we're learning a lot about soil health, we're learning a lot about non-chemical production practices that allows us to sort of change sort of quote-unquote conventional agriculture as well. So I think that there is a real opportunity to say perhaps we need to have a broader perspective on production research.
And I think it works both ways.
Yeah.
There's information coming from conventional to organic now, and I think that that's why this idea of regenerative agriculture is something that can bridge that gap.
Hugo, did you signal you wanted to add in?
Yeah, I certainly agree with many of the things that have been said, and they are correct from my perspective. I just want to share that some of those perspectives from a global perspective worry me. They worry me. Yes, a farmer needs to be a manager. Farmer needs to be a manager. And farmers manage in the best way they can. Perhaps not in the most adequate way that we expect them to manage, but they manage until they cannot. At least 70% of the food in the developing world is produced by small farmers. And when we focus on issues of protein, we worry because the population in the developing world is increasing, because people are making more money, and because our planet has to produce more food to feed all those other people who are being born in the developing world. Well, the reality of the developing world reflects in the march of thousands of Central Americans today, trying to cross Mexico to reach the southern border of the United States and perhaps Canada. And this happens when you are not able to manage anymore, even if you have the knowledge, even if you have the skills, even if you have the will, even if you have the experience of generations managing and producing the food that people are eating in those countries. The management can happen, but the conditions, and that's why I emphasize the issue of stability, is critical, because there is no idea, no technology that can be sustainably applied to feed the people who are being born in increasing numbers in the developing world if there is no stability.
Gloria, anything to add? Or?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said and what Mike was saying about being managers. And I talk to farmers and they say, we think of ourselves as environmental stewards. But the problem is we need to be paid to do the right thing as well. And I don't think farmers and our food prices reflect what needs to be done in terms of supporting farmers so that they can grow food the way it should be grown.
Okay, I'm going to go here and then here. And if there's anybody else, let me know.
Yeah, so again, with a question back to Brent, it's a double question if you don't mind. First of all, what is the difference between regenerative agriculture and, say, something like agroecology? And secondly, translating back your comment about regenerative, how does that actually come back to the question around sustainable protein?
Okay, so regenerative agriculture and agroecology share a lot of common ideas, and I know that Gabrielle can probably talk about this tomorrow in more detail. But the thing that attracts me to the idea of regenerative is very specific, and so the goal is to increase soil carbon and to increase and nurture the life that exists within the soil, to create a living soil. And it involves things like minimal disturbance, so no-till, and maintaining living plants in the soil at all times, ideally. And one of the principles, the second part of the question, is that animals should be integrated into production systems wherever possible. So the recognition is that when you have animals on pasture and you manage them well, they actually drive really, really rapid transfer of carbon from the atmosphere to the ground. So the picture that's actually still up on the screen here, there's two long swaths of white, which are row cover covering our salad greens, and then a big sort of silvery piece next to it, and that's a tarp. That's a huge piece of plastic. So we're experimenting with no-till techniques on our farm, where we will, instead of tilling our salad stubble after harvesting, we'll cover it with that tarp allow it all to break down, and then to plant into undisturbed soil. And we're seeing unbelievable, really rapid results. But the next step in a regenerative system would be when we plant cover crops on that piece of ground next year in order to nourish the soil, that we add animals in to graze down those cover crops, and it's going to just accelerate all that good stuff that's happening.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I think also in regenerative agriculture, and I'm not the expert, but from speaking with farmers who are doing it, it's about increasing ecosystem services, period, not just soil carbon, but anything we can do to restore the ecosystems that have been destroyed by agriculture. So anything like planting pollinator crops or hedgerows and providing a habitat for different animals. So it's a really holistic way of looking at things.
Okay, and go here. Please introduce yourself before speaking.
Good day, Kathleen Benny with Faculty of Agriculture in Nova Scotia. So I am delighted with the discussion today, and I'm curious what you might all pick. I'm going to offer a challenge a bit. If we want to get the world fed in a sustainably healthy and equitable manner, I'd like you to choose one of your favorite stakeholders, and what action would you get us onto? Like, raise the bar for urgency, raise the bar for immediacy to some extent. Who would you call on to take action to make sure we're getting the world fed?
Who would like to jump in first?
I'll go first. I'm going to stick with the persons that I talked about in my talk, is the people. We will not drive change if we don't change consumer behavior. If we don't get North Americans and Europeans to eat less, we will take some pressure off. We will keep pressure on the food system. I think we also, it boggles my mind. Goretty said, well, farmers say they're not getting paid for stuff. To a significant degree, consumers have no idea how food is produced. None. That's different than in the developing world where they're much closer to agriculture. But the average consumer, I am convinced there are kids in Toronto who think that milk grows on trees in 4-liter bags. There is just no understanding. And so if we're trying to articulate that we need to drive change in the food system, it's hard to get people to understand that abstraction if they don't know what the base is. And so to a significant, we regularly, when we do consumer surveys, we do tests of understanding. So they sort of say, well, we think we understand relatively well, and then we say, okay, prove it, and we ask them some questions. And I mean, simple questions like a cow has to have a calf in order to give milk. Only 25% of Canadians can answer that question correctly. So if you have I mean, that's a bit of an indictment of our high school biology, because that's basic mammalian biology. But if you're then saying, okay, if you're speaking to a consumer who doesn't get that, how are you going to talk to them in a nuanced way about how we're changing production practice? You know, issues of welfare, issues of antibiotic use, issues of balancing production. So I think, we need to drive consumers to think differently about food, to think, and it's complex because they're not all the same, but also probably, and get a little bit up on my hobby horse, get a little bit more food education into the education system so that people have I mean, it's so fundamental that people have an understanding where things are coming from, so they understand the implications of the choices they're making.
Great, thank you.
Anybody else? Hugo?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
We're being too polite. So I agree with Mike, and I said I can't choose one, so I'm glad he said that. I can just agree with him. But the other thing there's a couple other things around consumer behavior. I mean, we've got climate change. We keep saying people have to change what they do, and nobody's changing it. So it's really hard to do that. I think we need policy. And one of the things we did see in looking at the 2004 Community Health Survey, and the more recent one, my student is just putting the results together on this, is that there's been a huge decrease in beef consumption in Canada, and we see that also at the national level. And a lot of it has to do with price. It's gotten more expensive for people to be able to eat beef. So I think there's the education part. I think consumers are easily led around diets as well. They want to lose weight. We've got keto diets. We've got paleo diets. We've got Atkins diets. They all emphasize protein, and we're over-proteinated. We've got twice the protein that we actually need in our diets, and we saw that through looking at the protein levels as well. So I think policymakers are really, really important, and how we price our food is really, really important.
Hugo, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'm a physician by training, and I was taught that whatever a drug doesn't cure, the knife will do the job. And with the time I got involved in these more complex and socially related, politically related issues I work with nowadays, I do think that consumer behavior is an important driver. I am convinced that an educated consumer is a stronger driver. But I do think that an unorganized, educated consumer like myself has very little impact in the system. I work with hundreds of students every year who are educated, who are conscious, and who purchase food on a daily basis. And I see and I discuss this issue with them. What is what you can do? Well, I won't buy it, and so on. But there are other forces that need to be also confronted in one way or the other. I'm not an activist. I wish I were more of an activist. I'm not talking about riots. I'm not talking about demonstrations every day, stopping the traffic that is already a problem in all the cities. I'm not talking about that. But I do think that in some of you work in raising the conscience of the society, but society has also means of organizing itself. And there are many interesting examples related to food production. Migrant farm workers or immigrant farm workers in Florida got organized and got a fairer, not necessarily a fair, but a better check when they organize themselves and can then negotiate with decision makers, but can negotiate also with the companies they work with. And some companies that by some people are, pointed out as part of the problem, have seen and have experienced that type of negotiation and have agreed upon better conditions. But if that doesn't happen, I don't think we got much of a chance.
Brent, did you want to
I just wanted to quickly go back to something that Hugo said earlier, in that I think in terms of policy, we need to, on a global scale, we need to recognize that most of the world's food right now is coming from small-scale, primarily female farmers in the developing world. And we have a lot of agricultural policies in Canada and in global institutions that are actively trying to supplant that production system with an unsustainable Western-based large-scale corporate model. And we need to reverse that. So we're actually supporting those farmers rather than trying to get rid of them.
I'll have here and then there. Oh, you first? Okay, so you can, and then here. And then I'll come to the audience in the back, so if there's anybody there, start thinking.
This question mainly for Mike, for everyone, of course. You're talking about the scientific literacy of the general public and how that may affect how we move forward on this issue. I'm curious how much you think the non-scientific discussions that happen, so I'm talking about people who make unscientific claims, who use pseudoscience. I mean, yourself said chemical-free farming. I know what you meant. I worried that some people might not understand the subtlety of what you're trying to say, chemicals, etc. How worried are you that people are going to make decisions about this based more on emotion, based more on sort of what people call the naturalistic fallacy rather than on actual data? I wonder how much you think that's going to play a role in the future discussions we have.
Sorry, and just introduce yourself quickly.
Sorry, it's Chris Lapos from the Guelph Science Society.
Thanks.
I think that's a significant issue. again, I think what I always say to students is there is no the consumer anymore. So I think there is a significant group of consumers who are making decisions based on something they read on social media or 3 lines they heard somewhere or whatever their source of information is. So there is a real problem with a lack of scientific literacy. And we were talking at breakfast this morning, partly as academics we're to blame because we haven't to a significant degree interacted and articulated very well what we do, what we know, what we don't understand, and why that matters to consumers. So I think that consumers have not only a lack of understanding of science, but a significant skepticism of science, and I think that that's something we need to. I think, though, that there is also a significant group of consumers sort of in the middle who are just going, there's just, I don't get any of it, and we're bombarding them with information. Goretty talked a little bit about policy. Policy is tough and doesn't always achieve what you want it to achieve. And so, to a degree, we've got consumers who are skeptical of science and are making decisions based on bad information. We've got consumers who are overwhelmed with information and then are defaulting to what they've bought in the past because it's easy, or what is the cheapest because it's the cheapest. And I mean, I'll give you an example. In Ontario now, any restaurant that has more than 20 locations has to put nutrition information, calorie information on the menu. Health Canada also wants to put warnings on the front of packaging relative to sugar, sodium, and fat content. And a lot of the research says that that's not working. We've done some work on menu labeling. The impact on food decisions is minimal. It means that some people who were going to choose something healthy choose something marginally healthier, and we see some behavior where people go right on and actually increase the calorie content of what they're going to eat because they see it as a challenge, particularly given that they're eating in a restaurant. So I think that there is to get back to your question, there is a significant element of people making choices based on bad information, and there's also a significant information of people defaulting to no choice because of too much information.
Hugo, you want to add in?
Yeah, I do think that subjectivity plays a very important role. You and I are here because of subjectivity. We think this is important. We think we're going to learn something. We can contribute to something. Our subjectivity is driving us. And it plays a big role in consumer behavior. What I'm a bit worried about is that given that consumer behavior is key to deal with the question we're dealing with, I feel like we shouldn't, even if it is that important, we shouldn't put all of our efforts at pointing sometimes at people who, yes, are consumers, but are victims also of a food system that is not working. There are people, and the people who are suffering from the double burn, stunting, obesity, the poorer you are, the higher your chances of being obese. That's what the literature shows. That's what our research shows. The more food insecure you are, the more chances you have to deal with metabolic syndrome. It's because of your emotions. It's because of your subjectivity. It's because you just don't want to use the means you have to acquire what the market is offering? Or is it because of something else? I do think that subjectivity plays a role, and emotions play a role. But I think in most of the cases, in the population groups that are suffering the issues that are basically underlying to all this discussion, are people who just can't afford it.
Goretty, you have something?
Just a quick thing around consumers and policy, and I agree with Mike. I've seen that as well. Nutrition labels don't work very well just for nutrition alone, but I was thinking more around food environments. So for example, I think Quebec is no longer, you can't put junk food commercials on kids' programming because, you know, there's that influence. So the food environment and what we do in the food environment is really important, just like what we do with tobacco. You know, changing the policy with time, you can't have tobacco in, you know, full view, you can't do this and this and that. And that has an influence. So it's more around the food environment so that it influences the consumers, because even as educated as we are, we don't always have a choice we can eat. So that's what I was going to
And again, I wasn't disagreeing with you. I was just, I think there isn't a single answer. And as an example, we've seen both in the US and in Ontario, changes in government that can then change policy that were probably positive originally for climate change that we're now, in many people's views, taking a step back. And so again, if we can't convince consumers who are also voters that some of this stuff matters, then again we can get positive policy undone by changes in government. So I think we're not going to answer in a 20-minute panel those key questions. These are complex questions, and there are multiple levers, I think. Getting back to your question, it's hard to come up with just one thing. And we have to address these complex problems with complex solutions.
Unless there's something, I'm going to come here because we're starting to run short on time, and then I'll go to the back, and if there's something there, I'll come here.
Sure, so my name's Jared, and I'm from Insects. And since it came up a couple times in this panel, I just have a couple of key points of reflection. One is, if you want to learn about food consumer behavior and choices, try to feed bugs to Westerners. A study was just done where they looked at data. It's more sustainable, arguably, healthy, and neither of those two were driving factors. What was the driving factor was, can it be yummy and delicious? And it was amazing that even with that objectivity, you know, we were just talking earlier that we don't consume cars the same way we consume food. We look at safety records and we make more objective choices. And food is so personal. So it's interesting for us to see studies begin to look at what is attractive or repulsive to people. The second thing is that sometimes I think we are conflating two different issues, because we have projects going on in Madagascar where we're using, you know, centric bugs that are traditional, that have been farmed for years but never in any kind of formal manner. And tackling those issues of food insecurity in Africa and other places is very different than our project with President's Choice and getting cricket powder on the shelves of Loblaw. So as a company looking at this entire business structure and food and how it's going to work logistically, it's very interesting to have these two contrast projects, if you will, going on concomitantly and what we can learn from each other with respect to them. The third thing is that if we talk specifically about crickets, let's say in cricket powder, unfortunately we use the term cricket protein. And I agree that Westerners get enough protein. The question is whether or not it's sustainable. The cool thing about the insects is that it's not just protein. They're very high in iron. You talked about iron deficiency anemia being the #1 nutritional health problem on the planet. So it's efficiency of the food. So a study was done looking at iron in beef compared to iron in insects. And not only was the concentration higher, but it was almost 75% more bioavailable. So when you're looking at LCAs and other things and looking to try make comparative analyses, if you don't know what kind of bang you're getting for your buck, the studies may be heavily flawed at the time. The other piece
sorry, we're getting close to the end of the session, so to get the panel in, yeah.
Is fiber, that we are generally fiber. You know, we're not getting enough fiber. And that's another piece of that ingredient that's protein, macronutrients, and fiber. So just try to set the context for that. So thank you. And
thank you. Is there any response from any of the panel?
Thank you very much for that. I do think that we have some of grad students working on insects and insect properties in Africa. What we have learned is that an insect is not equal to another insect, and the nutritional qualities might be different. and also the anthropological factor you alluded to plays a big role. There are places where people raise or harvest wild animals or insects to sell somewhere else because in their beliefs, they shouldn't eat those animals themselves, but others can, and we can get some money from that.
I've just, we've done a little bit of work on insects. We will be doing some more. The issue of it's got to taste good is true no matter what you're eating. So it's going to be hard to get people to eat something that they really don't like, and I think that's true. That's why we're eating lots of refined sugar. That's why the food insecure. It's cheap. Fat, sugar, salt are cheap, and so no matter who you are, getting people the additional issue relative to insects, particularly in the Western world, is even if you get it to taste good, if you tell some people that it's insects, there's the ick factor, even if they can't taste it. So it's not eating a cricket and having the feet, chocolate covered or whatever, a novelty treat. Even if you tell someone that this protein bar with chocolate and oats and other things in it has some cricket powder in it, they will cringe before they even, and it will, if you don't tell them, they'll like it. If you do tell them, they won't. So it is not an insignificant challenge, but I don't think it's an insurmountable one.
All right, I'm going to try to give, unless somebody's jumping in, try and give somebody from the audience a chance to ask a question. We have a couple minutes left, so we'll go to the back. This gentleman there. Did you raise your hand? Yep. Yeah. Yes, please, go ahead.
I'm a philosopher at University. One of the things that's coming up implicitly in what a lot of you are saying is the problems with ethical frameworks. So an ethicist. The problem with ethical frameworks traditionally is they're individual based, so the accountability that we're talking about is accountability to each other and yourselves. We're talking about our population problems, where if you think at an individual level, as has already been said, that one individual can hold themselves responsible for climate change, for environmental destruction, for habitat loss, that's something catastrophic, or for deprivation of the ocean. There needs to be a re-envisioning of ethics to include both that level of accountability, but a level of accountability at a higher level, at a third level, where we can actually see that we are at that level as we are the individual. And people like Jill Gibson and Susan Sherwin have been arguing this, but it's a fundamental problem with our traditional ethical frameworks that they're individualized. And it's recurring implicitly in all of what you're saying. But there is a need to wrap up a discussion of a re-envisioning about to include more group level accountability, responsibility that translates into something that means something at the individual level of accountability.
Okay. I'm not sure if I got a specific question there, but we're at the end of the session. If anybody has any last burning thoughts that they want to add in 1 minute or less.
I just wanted to quickly get back to the question of deliciousness, because I think it's important when you're talking about food. And I think when we're talking about driving consumer behavior, we found that working with chefs has been extremely important, because the biggest trend that we've seen in our restaurant customers over the past 10 years has been a move away from protein at the center of the plate to vegetables. And that is having a ripple effect all down through the society, and I think it eventually permeates to all levels of society. And the way that chefs have managed to do that is by making it delicious. The level of vegetarian or vegan cooking now is light years ahead of where it was 10 years ago. And so all of these cultural and emotional and pleasure aspects to this discussion are super important, and I think working, farmers and academics have to work with these sort of tastemakers in society to gently push our agenda.
Okay, thank you. On the interest of time, I think we'll end it there, but I would like to say thank you to all our panelists for a very interesting discussion, and thank you to you as well.